The Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the subcommittee at any time. The subcommittee is meeting today to hear testimony on the mineral supply chain and the new space race. I ask unanimous consent that the following members be allowed to testify today with the subcommittee to give their testimony and participate in the hearing from the dais. The gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Crane. The gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Lamborn. Without objection, so ordered. Under Committee Rule 4F, any oral opening statements at the hearing are limited to the chairman and the ranking minority member. I therefore ask unanimous consent that all other members' statements be made part of the hearing record if they are submitted in accordance with Committee Rule 3.0. Without objection, so ordered. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. Good morning, everyone, and thank you to all the witnesses who have traveled such a long way to get here to testify on this important and somewhat new issue for the subcommittee: the mineral supply chain and the new space race. The witnesses before us today are among the most preeminent intellects and entrepreneurs in their field, so I look forward to our discussion. Now, I understand that mining in space is not an issue that we hear about every day in Congress, but the fact is that the rest of the world, including some of our greatest competitors like China and Russia, has started a new space race. This time, it isn't a race to land someone on the moon for bragging rights. It is a race to establish a permanent, sustained space presence that will allow these countries to tap into the vast resources in space and subsequently control life on Earth in immeasurable ways. Sadly, with the governments of China and Russia have already completed a lap around the track, and the U.S. government is seemingly unaware that the race has even started. Today's hearing aims at to change that. The effort to mine in space is driven by the immediate and projected global demands for minerals. Minerals including copper, lithium, cobalt, and dozens of others are integral to our modern way of life and the technological innovation. There are increased obstacles to mining on Earth, so turning outwards reflects the unfortunate reality that space mining is more and more a necessity. Mineral demand driven by technological change is exacerbated by climate goals and heavy-handed mandates from governments, including mandates from the Biden administration that force mineral-dependent electric vehicles on American consumers. As a result, global demands for critical minerals is projected to be more than doubled by 2030, and that's a conservative estimate. Sadly, President Biden and his cronies have been making America increasingly reliant on our foreign adversaries for mineral supplies. The Biden administration is increasingly mineral demand with unprecedented government intervention into private markets, while at the same time doing everything in its power to strangle our domestic mining industry, including shutting down mining projects in my state of Arizona. The actions by President Biden are further exacerbating America's dangerous reliance on China for critical minerals. At this time, the United States is import reliant on China for 26 of the 50 minerals designated as critical by the USGS and the Department of Interior. China also dominates the mineral refining process, accounting for 85 to 90% of the global rare earth element mine to metal refining. China's dominance of mineral supply chains on Earth presents a grave threat to America's national security and economic interests. Additionally, the minerals integral to modern life are typically come from resource-rich countries that are among the most egregious violators of human rights and the environment. For example, the Democratic Republic of Congo is associated with horrific environmental degradation and slave labor, yet it produces 2/3 of the world's cobalt. It is not a reach to say that a child in Congo is currently risking his or her life so that Americans can have unlimited access to smartphones and electrical vehicles. As elected officials and Americans, members of the committee cannot and should not turn a blind eye to where and how we get the minerals that have become essential to our modern day of life. The United States has a choice of how it responds to this exponential demand for minerals. We can increase support domestic production where we are certain for our responsible development practices, or allow foreign nations with unacceptable labor and environmental standards to dominate the global market. In order to maximize the national security, economic, and environmental interests of the United States, prioritizing domestic mineral production is key. While it is overdue for the United States to unleash domestic mineral development, America must also prepare to lead the world into the next frontier, space mining. As a country, we must accept that we are in the midst of a new space race, and we must take steps to secure the celestial mineral supply chain to provide a stable future for the United States and the free world. Undoubtedly, we must also overcome major hurdles to make space mining a reality. This includes the transportation costs, logistical and technological hurdles, and the inherent uncertainty of space activity. However, if the United States can develop the ability to tap into these vast mineral resources on celestial bodies such as moons, Mars, and asteroids, the potential may in fact be limitless. Eventually, the volume and the value of the space mining will provide immeasurable benefits to whoever controls the celestial mineral supply chain and will prove disastrous for those who ignore it. China and Russia are committed to mining in space, and if we don't start preparing for the future of our resource development now, we will continue to find ourselves in a vulnerable position. Thus, America must take the necessary steps to secure our mineral supply chains by increasing domestic mineral development and leading the development of space mining activities. I now recognize the ranking member, Ms. Stansbury, for her 5 minutes.
All right, well, good morning, everyone, and thank you, Chairman Gosar, and to my colleagues for this interesting hearing this morning. I'm looking forward to hearing from our expert witnesses. And I have to say, Mr. Chairman, when it came across my desk that we were going to have a hearing on space mining in the Natural Resources Oversight Committee, I did not have this on my bingo card this session, so I'm looking forward to the discussion today. Now, I agree with the chairman that we absolutely have to address our critical minerals issues. We've had countless hearings in this committee and other hearings across committees across Congress. We all know that this is a crucial national security issue, but I think that we have to also be realistic about the science, and I think we're going to hear a bit about that today. You know, space mining, if it does transpire, is not in the immediate future, and so some of the issues that have been raised about our national security interests and supply chains cannot be resolved by pursuing this particular avenue. And in fact, we know that many of the things that have to be pursued in the short term are right in front of us. And that is why the Biden administration has passed and put into place a whole of supply chain effort to address our critical minerals with their strategy that they've put together. And that includes stockpiling the critical minerals that we do have access to. It means collaborations with our allies around the world where critical minerals are located. It means that as international stewards, we ensure that the practices for sourcing those minerals follow human rights protocols and environmental protection. And of course, that we help to promote a circular economy here on Earth, because we are in fact going to need these critical minerals in order to make this clean energy transformation that we are all undergoing right now. So it is important that we address these issues, and I do look forward to hearing from our folks today who are going to share about the near-term and longer-term aspirations of mining in space, what the technology looks like, what the ethical, moral, and legal considerations of all of that is. But we have to actually act here on Earth in the meantime. You know, there are also a number of issues that we have to be conscious of as we're pursuing these strategies. You know, this is an interesting hearing to have in this committee, which has primary jurisdiction over our public lands and waters and works with our indigenous nations. And certainly we want to make sure that we don't repeat the mistakes of the past as we pursue new technological options to pursue the sourcing of critical minerals. But I do have to say, it's the last week of Congress. We're about to gavel out in 2 weeks. We still haven't passed a real budget yet for the federal government. We still haven't actually addressed many of the big issues that are immediately in front of us. We have unsustainable leadership. There's fights in the halls happening. You know, we had a member expelled from Congress just 2 weeks ago. It's really a chaotic time, and so it is a bit strange, I think, for this committee, which is an oversight committee, to be holding a hearing on space mining based on an aspiration that is possibly decades down the line while our country is facing real crises. So while I am looking forward to hearing about this important issue, and I greatly appreciate the expertise of our witnesses who traveled here to come share today, it is a bit of an odd distraction from the most pressing issues that our country is facing right now. But I do look forward to the conversation, and Mr. Chairman, I turn it back to you.
I think the gentlelady, you know, I'm always a believer you can chew gum and walk at the same time. I think we're going to find some interesting avenues in regards to our panel. You know, Armageddon might be closer than you think. So I also want to wave on Campbell or Dove for the panel, please? Yeah. Now I'm going to introduce our witnesses. First, we have Mr. Eric Sundby, co-founder and CEO of TerraSpace, executive director of Space Force Association, Boerne, Texas. Then there's Dr. Greg Autry, director and clinical professor, Space Leadership Policy and Business, Thunderbird School of Global Management, Arizona State University, Phoenix, Arizona. Dr. Moses Milazzo, owner, other orb, chief scientist for NASA's Planetary Data Ecosystem, right in Flagstaff, Arizona. And then there's Ms. Michelle Hanlon, executive director, Center for Air and Space Law, University of Mississippi School of Law, University of Mississippi. Let me remind the witnesses that under committee rules, you must limit your oral statements to 5 minutes, but the entire statement will appear in the hearing record. To begin your testimony, the on position for the microphone, you just have to push your microphone. We use timing lights here, so at 5 minutes, you see the green light. When it gets to the last minute, it turns yellow, and then finally, when it's red, you want to summarize up. I now recognize Mr. Sundby for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman Gosar, Ranking Member Stansbury, honorable members of the subcommittee. I want to thank you for having us here today to speak on this issue of critical importance to our nation's security and standing on the global stage. My name is Eric Sundby. I'm the co-founder and CEO of TerraSpace, a mineral exploration company applying artificial intelligence to the mineral analysis process. I also serve as the executive director of the Space Force Association, a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization dedicated to supporting Space Force guardians and their families and advocating for strong national and allied space power. Humanity stands on the precipice of a new era, one that will be defined by space development and the utilization of space resources. Space holds an endless amount of opportunity for America, both economic and strategic. Yet this opportunity is challenged by the Chinese Communist Party and its allies in Russia and a growing number of states, as China has launched the International Lunar Research Station Organization Initiative over the last year. In 2015, the Strategic Support Force was established, providing a more organized structure for the space forces of the People's Liberation Army. It is through this institution that the China Manned Space Program is housed, which oversees all astronauts, operations, and space infrastructure development. Lastly, in 2019, the Chinese Lunar Exploration Program Director equated the moon and other celestial bodies in the solar system to a series of island chains currently controlled by the Philippines and Japan, of which has been a point of contention in the CCP's illegal territorial expansion in the South China Sea. Given actions here on Earth, the potential for great power competition in the space domain, particularly over space resources, is not on the horizon. It has already arrived. In 2022, the United States Geological Survey, as you know, classified 50 mineral commodities that have no viable substitutes and are essential to the economic security of the United States. Many of these natural resources have been discovered on celestial bodies in our solar system, including on the moon and in the asteroid belt. Our ability to access and utilize these critical minerals here on Earth is threatened, as China currently controls 60% of production and 85% of processing capacity, according to analysis by the USGS and Natural Resources Canada. This threat to our mineral supply chain calls for new and innovative ways at looking at resources from a national perspective, with space resources being front and center. This upcoming month, in January 2024, a company from my home state of Texas, Intuitive Machines, will return America to the lunar surface for the first time since 1972. What is notable about this feat is that it is done by a commercial company. This commercialization of access to space is what gives our country the strategic advantage. It is private enterprise that will provide new opportunities in the field of mineral discovery, mining, and processing, and will open up access to space resources. I want to urge this committee to investigate ways in which the government can encourage and lower entry barriers for technologies that can be applied to support the established earth mining industry, while also enabling the discovery and access to resources off-planet. Various government agencies offer commercial companies the opportunity to contribute to research and develop technologies through programs such as Small Business Innovation Research Grants, or SBIRs. One area of improvement could be the USGS offering specific grants and support to companies developing technology to enable faster and less environmentally impactful methods of discovery and access of critical minerals, with an emphasis on such dual-use technologies as I mentioned earlier. The use of space resources in alleviating the mineral supply chain here on Earth will not be an easy or quick task. I want to be clear about that. This must be a long-term strategic goal of the United States. Nevertheless, the development of technologies capable of operating in the harsh environment of space will enable further discovery and access to critical minerals here on Earth, such as those in existing mine sites, in more remote locations on land, and the deep seabed. Numerous startups and commercial companies are leading in this field and are offering services in critical minerals while exemplifying the pioneering spirit of American innovation. President John F. Kennedy vowed that we shall not see space governed by a hostile flag of conquest, but by a banner of freedom and peace. It is up to the government to prioritize our nation's mineral supply chain and open the way for such companies to carry the spirit forward into this new era. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sundby. I now recognize Dr. Autry for his 5 minutes.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, and honorable members of the committee. I am testifying on my own behalf. The views expressed here are not the views of any organization. I will speak on the specific strategic significance of extraterrestrial resource extraction in the context of China's competitive space development agenda. My remarks are not intended to disparage the people of China. They are aimed at the corrupt dictatorship that exploits its people and threatens our planet. I also appreciate the nonpartisan nature of space policy. Seeing this hearing, Dr. A.J. Mashal, a colleague of mine from Purdue, sent me a note. He wrote, "Strategic materials and manufacturing have always created new, real wealth. America has handed that source of wealth to other nations in every key sector, from semiconductors to aerospace. Space is a new frontier and offers a second chance to revise that era and to go from being consumers to makers. That process must begin with the supply of basic factor inputs, including minerals." Dr. Malche's comments underscore how appropriate it is for this important decision to be held now in this committee. Dr. Malche's observations are driven by a Keynesian economic perspective which prioritizes consumption above production. When our economy slows, the prescription is always stimulate the consumers into the mall. This has funded a dangerous military dictatorship and pushed us into stagflation. The Chinese Communist Party, on the other hand, harbors no delusions about the source of national wealth and power. It is laser-focused on capital, resources, and productive capacity, as we once were. China buys mines and lands in Africa, Latin America, and even in the US, and then blocks others from buying theirs. Earth's moon, on the other hand, is roughly the size of Africa, is covered with impact craters, and some of these are composed of nickel and iron and platinum group metal asteroid cores. Analysis of NASA data suggests that an enormous mass concentration is buried near the moon's south pole. Dr. Peter James of Baylor University describes that as a pile of metal 5 times larger than the big island of Hawaii. NASA's Psyche mission will be the first to visit a metal asteroid. The press has suggested that mining Psyche will make us all billionaires. The reality is that when we do learn to mine these materials, market prices will adjust, but everyone on Earth will lead richer lives. Astroforge of Huntington Beach, California, is focused on the return of important platinum group metals that are rare here on Earth. TransAstra is planning on mining ice near the poles for water, as well as oxygen and hydrogen for rocket power. Origin Space of Shenzhen, China, on the other hand, has raised 150 million yuan, and China's Moonzar is all in on the idea of extracting helium-3 from lunar regolith for fusion power. The Chinese know that space mining challenges are surmountable and will produce positive externalities, and they're working on it now. Mining on the moon and asteroids, processing ore, and delivering products to our markets in space or Earth is not simple and will not happen quickly. It will demand advances like AI-controlled mining equipment and automation and nuclear power solutions. Technological spin-offs from the first space race enriched our nation and transformed the world. Technologies required for space mining will also be applicable to Earth. Now, I know some will suggest that we halt space development until we deal with every problem on Earth or till we can ensure that resources are equitably distributed for everyone on Earth. I appreciate that. But the CCP will continue without regard to rights or rules, and they will leverage their monopolies against nations large and small. Any delay in America's development of space resources, no matter how well intended, will leave the field to that rapacious regime. I have some recommended actions for Congress. Provide additional R&D funding for dual-use technologies that enable both space resource extraction and advanced terrestrial mining, including the detection of subsurface mineral deposits and AI-enabled autonomous deep mining systems. Support a permanent and sustainable presence on the moon with our partners in the Artemis Accords. Appropriate additional funding to NASA's Science Mission Directorate for continued exploration of lunar and asteroid resources. Appropriate additional funding to DOE and NASA's Space Technology Mission Directorate for the development of nuclear space power solutions. Further clarify our interpretation of the Outer Space Treaty in language that supports a legal framework conducive to the development of space resources by private actors, including the security of exclusive operating areas in ways that will allow space mining to be transferable and collateralizable. Clearly direct the U.S. Space Force to prepare for the future protection of American commerce in cislunar space and celestial bodies. Let me close with a quote often attributed to Eleanor Roosevelt that I think speaks to the topic of why we should do this now. She said, "The future belongs to those who show up." Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Autry. I now recognize Dr. Milazzo for his 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Gosar, Ranking Member Stansbury, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Dr. Moses Milazzo. I'm the founder and owner of Other Orb LLC, a successful small business that provides planetary science consulting services to a variety of U.S. institutions, including private and public universities, for-profit and nonprofit scientific organizations, and federal agencies such as NASA. I appear today on my own behalf and not as a representative of any institution, agency, organization, or business. I thank you for the opportunity and honor to present testimony to this hearing. My goal through this testimony is to encourage you to proceed with careful consideration of the following aspects of any future space mining: resource and energy development, ethical consideration of public investment and returns, and ethical consideration of environmental and human burden that may be created by said mining. The near-term enabling energy technologies for space-based mining will be solar, panels, and batteries. We have the opportunity with the rapid growth of alternative energy sources and electric vehicles to help develop more efficient and more resilient solar panels, to support and tap into research and development of new, more robust and more energy-dense battery technologies, and to expand the testing environment of such batteries. Solar energy and EVs on our roads and highways represent the most advanced testing laboratory available for improving energy collection, storage, and use, and the lessons learned can be applied to operations in space. To guarantee that the public will benefit from an investment of public funds into space mining, we need to ensure that public funding will be allocated in an equitable manner. Anyone with the appropriate knowledge and skills will be able to compete for this funding. Public funding will not only go to large and rich companies. Public funding and the companies that receive this funding will be well regulated, that monopolies will not be permitted, that we will regulate the industry to ensure public good is achieved through public funding, and that this public funding does not create additional wealth disparities within our communities. We also need to consider who will be responsible for the oversight of companies receiving federal funding for space mining. We have historically failed to enact effective regulations during the earliest stages of a new industry. For example, during the industrial age disasters such as burning rivers were the result in part of an unregulated industry. We now have the opportunity to consider not only whether and how to fund this budding industry, but also how to ensure it protects and benefits the public that pays for it. Space mining endeavors will have far-reaching impacts for humanity, and therefore anti-colonialism must be a central tenet of our regulation of the space mining industry. It is incumbent upon us as we borrow from the future to make decisions that benefit as much of humanity as possible, both today and far into the future. Just as various cultures hold certain geographical sites and features on Earth sacred, many cultures hold some planetary bodies sacred. We must seriously consider the harm that mining planetary bodies may cause to those cultures. Our concern for Apollo landing site preservation is no different from the concern others have for the preservation of whole planetary bodies in space. A thorough and thoughtful plan for development of space mining must include codified protections and cooperative international agreements to preserve historical and cultural treasures. The question of whether, and if so how, to mine in space is one that needs careful consideration before a large expenditure of public funds is made. We stand in a singular position to do the right thing. We must use the lessons of history and advances in technology to not only help people on Earth in the near term, but to conserve our legacy for far future generations. Now is the time to bring in all stakeholders to discuss whether we should mine in space, how we might do so, and how doing so may benefit everyone rather than just a few people. The ideas and concerns I raise here are not exhaustive, but are intended as a framework for starting a deeper and more detailed dialogue. To be clear, I am not opposed to mining in space. Personally, I think that there may be more positive outcomes than negative. But I am only one person, and as a scientist, I want my ideas, concerns, and excitement to be peer-reviewed by others with different perspectives. To that end, I urge the convening of a committee composed of historians, cultural experts, indigenous representatives, ethicists, planetary scientists, lawyers, archaeologists, anthropologists, industry experts, regulation and policy experts, and federal agencies to carefully consider the two main questions of whether, and if so, how, to encourage, regulate, and fund U.S. mining in space. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Milazzo. I now recognize Ms. Hanlon for her 5 minutes.
Chairman, Ranking Member, and members of the subcommittee, I thank you for convening this hearing, which recognizes that the ability to access and utilize extraterrestrial natural resources must be considered as the United States looks to the future of the mineral supply chain. And I thank you for your invitation to testify. My name is Michelle Hanlon. I'm a space lawyer. I'm the executive director of the Center for Air and Space Law at the University of Mississippi. I'm the co-founder and president of For All Moonkind, which is the only organization in the world focused on protecting human heritage in outer space, like the Apollo and Luna landing sites. And finally, I'm also the founder and executive director of the Institute on Space Law and Ethics. I am heartened to see growing recognition of both the promise of space resources and the fact that we find ourselves once again in a space race. Only this time, the stakes are much higher than before. This race is not about prestige. It's about access to resources that can benefit the lives of all Americans, all humanity. And it's about the governance framework that will support the management of these resources and all future space activities. Earth occupies a very small part of space. Around us are an infinite source of resources. How we characterize the extraterrestrial domain is important. The U.S. considers space to be a unique domain of human activity, not a global commons. This description of the cosmos allows for responsible stewardship while leaving open possibilities we have not yet had the opportunity to contemplate. Indeed, we may one day agree that the broad expanse of space is susceptible to not one, but several categorizations. It is important, vital, that we use our terrestrial experience to inform, not constrain, our view of the universe and the management and use of its resources. Space is not a global commons, but nor is it a lawless wonderland. However, the international regime governing extraterrestrial activities was not designed for space resource utilization. The treaty instruments were developed under the guidance of President Eisenhower with the primary goal of keeping outer space for peaceful purposes. The Outer Space Treaty has been largely successful in this regard, but it leaves much susceptible to interpretation in other regards, a dangerous circumstance. For example, the Outer Space Treaty states that space shall be free for exploration and use by all, which implies that resource extraction is permissible, an interpretation President Obama endorsed as U.S. law in 2015, and which is also enshrined in the multilateral Artemis Accords. But the treaty also states that a nation may not claim territory in space by any means. Occupying a mineral-rich area of an asteroid could be considered a territorial claim. Article 9 of the Outer Space Treaty requires that parties act in space with due regard to the activities of others. Thus, under the Outer Space Treaty, simply maintaining a presence in one specific area of a celestial body might violate the non-appropriation principle. However, the concept of due regard suggests that if one entity is already occupying, others must avoid interfering. This gives a tremendous advantage to those who simply establish a presence first. And so the race begins. The Artemis Accords propose that due regard requires others to respect reasonable safety zones around activities. But what is reasonable? Without a more specific construct of due regard, the entity that gets to a desirable area first can easily make the argument that due regard reasonably requires other parties to maintain a distance measured in kilometers in order to assure the protection of their operations. What's worse, these rules could by default apply not just to one particular celestial body, but can become the foundation for all extraterrestrial resource management, wherever the source. Currently, the U.S.'s closest competitor in this new space race is China. China has made no secret of its own space resource utilization plans. And remember, winning requires only getting there first. Once a spacecraft of any kind lands or even crashes in a mineral-rich area, due regard, it could be asserted, requires that no other entity approach within 20 or more kilometers of that certain spacecraft, thereby creating a safety zone that effectively excludes access by others to any minerals found in that area. We must accelerate our efforts to assure continued access to extraterrestrial resources. This hearing is a first but significant small step. U.S. policy as a whole, and not just space policy, must acknowledge and embrace the vast resources the universe offers. The U.S. must encourage and increase support for commercial mining activities. The U.S. must also continue to encourage the growth of the Artemis Accords and work within the Accords and the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space to better define due regard. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Hanlon. I thank all the witnesses for their testimony. Now I'm going to go to members on the dais for their questions. I recognize the gentleman from Montana, Mr. Rosendale, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and Ranking Member Stansberry for holding this hearing today. It's a very important subject. It underscores the urgent need to diminish our dependence on foreign adversaries for crucial minerals. These minerals are essential to America's success in the 21st century, and we cannot rely on our enemies for them. China is deeply invested in controlling the critical mineral supply chain. The more we rely on them for these resources, the more of a threat they pose to our sovereignty. It's especially concerning that the CCP is exerting its control on a global stage, increasing the possibility of a future dominated by China. Currently, the United States relies on China for 26 of the 50 critical minerals designated by the Department of Interior as a cause for concern. China not only controls production, but also dominates the refining process, and hardly anyone is talking about that. The United States finds itself at a crossroads. We must decide whether to reopen our mining and refining operations, regaining control over our destiny with respect to these critical minerals, or continue down a path of increased dependence and economic entanglement with the CCP. Unfortunately, the current administration seeks to import these minerals from countries that use child labor and produce emissions. We could mine critical mines ethically and cleanly now, right here at home, but instead we rely on third world countries in the name of environmentalism. I am intrigued by extracting minerals in space, especially as China races there. However, I want to ensure that this does not replace extracting the critical minerals in our own backyard. One thing I've learned living in Montana, where everything is freight in and freight out. Transportation costs are extremely expensive. Looking to space for minerals where they may be plentiful is interesting, but it will present incredible access challenges. And to hear comments about how we have to make sure that the environmental standards are met or that the public receives their funding back after they make the investments. I have a real big problem with that. I am a skeptic. I'll be honest with you, because the nations that we compete with right now do not follow the labor or environmental standards that are in place with the international community as it exists, whether it be by norms or mandates. And yet, somehow, this panel believes that they're going to follow those in outer space? You're kidding yourselves. You're absolutely kidding yourselves. Mr. Autry, you begin with your testimony by quoting, "Strategic minerals and manufacturing have always created new real wealth." And I agree with that. I absolutely do. America has handed that source of wealth to other nations. We've literally developed the technology and then handed it to them. Space is a new frontier and offers a second chance to reverse that error. Rather than focusing solely on space exploration, why not consider a dual course of action that combines space endeavors with domestic production in the United States? How do you envision balancing the opportunities presented by space exploration with the immediate advantages of more cost-effective and less risk-intensive resource mining here at home on our own soil?
Thank you, sir. Excellent question. I want to be clear, I don't know how you might have gotten the idea that the entire panel supports some of the things that you rallied against. I don't think that that's the case. And I also want to be clear, at no point would I have suggested that we do not pursue an aggressive development of U.S. resources in an attempt to rectify the mistakes we've made here on Earth with our global supply chain. That needs to happen. Back in 2010, I wrote a book called Death by China, and in that book I addressed the issue of the Molycorp mine at Mountain Pass, California, which back around 2000 produced 80% of the world's rare earth elements. China shut that mine down using aggressive dumping of products made with abusive environmental behavior in Mongolia and Sichuan. And then they jacked up rare earth element prices, and then they managed to get control of the output of that mine, which is all shipped to China now. I tried to bring this to people's attention, and you know what I got? Do you realize we have an economic crisis here in the United States, and we have this problem and that problem? We don't have time to worry about that right now. Well, this is where we are in space.
So my time is just about up, Mr. Autry. So what I'm trying to say is that if we can't get those minerals produced here domestically, when we have the technology, the labor standards, the environmental standards, how in the world do you think that we're going to be, and why would you recommend that we take unlimited amount of public dollars to do it in outer space?
I didn't say unlimited at all. I do believe investing in that technology will benefit us here on Earth.
I thank the gentleman from Montana. The gentlelady, Ms. Kemlinger Dove, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It is always a new experience on this committee. China and Russia are exploitatively mining in Africa, and Russia is mining democracy and sovereignty in Ukraine, two critical national security threats that Republicans continue to slow walk when it comes to solutions or even acknowledging that they're issues. A couple of years ago, the movie Don't Look Up came out, and I can't help but bring it up now. The movie is about two scientists who discover that an asteroid big enough to wipe out all of life on planet Earth is headed towards us. The scientists try to convince the U.S. government to divert the asteroid, but they get sidelined when an eccentric billionaire convinces the president we should mine the asteroid for valuable minerals instead. A highly politicized asteroid denial campaign ensues, but in the end, facts win. While the movie was widely known to be a satirical take on the threat of the climate crisis and the refusal of some to take it seriously, it looks like my colleagues across the aisle didn't get the joke. Nearly a year into Republican control of the House, and this committee has yet to have a single hearing on the biggest threat of our time. Just to remind everyone, 2023 will be the hottest year ever recorded, and not by a small margin. Extreme weather events like hurricanes in California, ice storms in Texas, and wildfire smoke in DC are now the norm. Hundreds of thousands of people are dying each year, local economies are being destroyed, and frontline communities are getting hurt first and worst. Yet many of my Republican colleagues still refuse to even talk about the climate crisis unless they can deny it. The idea of passing any climate legislation this Congress is a fantasy. In fact, every Republican who was here last year voted against the single biggest investment in clean energy and climate action in history, the Inflation Reduction Act. Don't get me wrong, if space mining becomes a reality, we must be absolutely clear-eyed about how it's managed. The environmental, economic, and social issues are important and challenging. So I am glad our witness, Dr. Milazzo, is here to document those issues into the congressional record. So yes, it is an important conversation to be had in the committee that can consider legislation about it. Newsflash, that committee is not this one. We repeatedly asked Republicans for a clear jurisdictional justification for it to be in this committee and never got one. Newsflash, today's hearing is not the most pressing issue for the American people. It's just one more attempt to get us to look away from their obvious inability to govern. They took 15 votes to pick a speaker, voted him out, wasted 3 weeks to find another one, and are now turning on him. They have bafflingly turned one government shutdown threat into two. Their government funding bills are being shelved by their own party, and they're raining down investigations that generate Fox News headlines, but no actual or factual evidence of wrongdoing. With that kind of rap sheet, I can understand the need for a flashy distraction. I guess my Republican colleagues did learn something from Don't Look Up after all. And with that, I yield back.
I was hoping we see a lot more questions to the panel instead of the pontificating that seems to come out of the West Coast. The gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Lamborn, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you all for being here. NASA and the U.S. Geological Survey have been working together to develop new technologies to detect and assess off-world mineral resources. Universities like the Colorado School of Mines, which hosts the nation's only space resources program, is also researching how to detect, assess, and utilize resources in space. These advanced technologies would likely have applications for domestic industries as well. Dr. Milazzo, how is NASA and USGS working with other federal partners like the Department of Commerce and Department of Energy to advance technologies that could support a new generation of low-impact, critical mineral extraction and production here on Earth?
Thank you, Congressman, for that question. I'm hesitant to speak for either NASA or the USGS. I was an employee of the U.S. Geological Survey some years ago, but now I'm no longer a civil servant. So I hesitate to speak for them about what efforts they are working on right now. The reality is that we have a lot of space-faring, Earth-pointed satellites that are helping to better understand resources and resource availability here on the Earth, across the Earth. And so the specifics of what the policies are and what the activities are right now, I am not fully informed of, so I want to be careful I don't speak for either of those agencies.
Okay, fine. Besides the investments we will need to make in technology, I know we will also need to be looking to academia to make investments in future jobs in space mining. In June, I co-led H.R. 4152, the Space Resources Institute Act, with fellow Colorado Representative Caraveo. The bill directs NASA and the Department of Commerce to report to Congress on options for establishing an institute related to space resources and to provide the necessary leadership in basic research, resource mapping, and technology development that could dramatically reduce the cost of commercial space missions, stimulate new industries, and maintain the United States leadership in space. So, Dr. Autry, what federal support is needed to encourage and leverage private sector investment and research into a more robust U.S. strategy?
Great, thank you. I do want to acknowledge the Colorado School of Mines leadership on this topic and my colleague George Sowers there in particular. They've done great work. As I stated in my testimony, I think reasonable amounts of R&D investment can help dual-use technologies that benefit mining both here on Earth and in space in a reasonable way, and it's not an excessive amount of money. I also think that we can look at working with academia to make sure that we address the issues that my colleague Dr. Milazzo has while moving forward in a timely manner, as Michelle Hanlon has mentioned, because if we don't, we will be ceding that field. It's also super important to make sure that we recognize some mechanism under which the mining operation sites and processing sites on a celestial body can be transferable and collateralizable so that debt investment as well as venture capital can come into this field and run it like a normal industry when it does emerge.
Okay, very good. And I also sit on the Armed Services Committee. We're concerned about what China is doing to become more aggressive in the Pacific and indeed in the entire world. So, Mr. Sundby, what are your biggest concerns when it comes to the fact that China is also in this race to secure the potential of rare metals from space resources?
My primary concerns is that the Chinese military the Chinese military essentially controls the entirety of their space program. Their space program has very little civil representation, essentially, and the People's Liberation Army is placed in authority to oversee their operations that will be conducted on the lunar surface. So when you see institutions such as the Lunar Research Organization that they've established with Russia, that institution will be staffed by military personnel. That is legal under the Outer Space Treaty, but it is highly concerning that that is the institution that will be overseeing all of their research and resource utilization and exploration on the surface of the moon.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from Colorado. The chairman for the whole committee is now recognized for his 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Gosar, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today. And I do want to take a minute and reassert that the committee does have jurisdiction on this issue. I know that has been questioned, but I don't think there's any question that our committee does have jurisdiction on this issue. And this is an issue that some people might ask, why are we doing this? This seems far-fetched. It seems like something that's, you could ask the question, why not mine the Earth first, and then we'll work on outer space later. But also, if we look at the past, people would have probably said the same thing about sending someone to the moon and the space race that we were in back then. And we know that there were some great discoveries and technological advances that came out of those efforts. When I was going over this hearing with staff, I was joking and said, have they found dilithium crystals, being a Star Trek fan? And I know you haven't, but one question I want to ask is, what are the possibilities of new advances or finding new materials and things that could be beneficial that we can't even imagine today? And if you are a Star Trek fan, you know that there were things on there that seemed really far-fetched and sci-fi when the show was made, but a lot of that are things that are actually kind of in our world today with communications and other things. But what opportunity do we have to advance our scientific knowledge by proceeding with space exploration for mining? And I'll start with Dr. Autry.
Thank you, sir. And I do have to underscore, I can't imagine why you're not allowed to discuss space resources in the Natural Resources Committee. This baffles me. I'm also lost on the idea of why America can't for once have long-term thinking, because every single problem that we have today, which we're so obsessed with solving today, and is distracting us from the future is because we weren't looking ahead of ourselves. We've been staring at our feet as we walk forward. There are unknown opportunities out there, sir, that we don't know what they are. They won't be dilithium crystals, but they may be just as amazing. When we entered the first space race, nobody predicted GPS, the internet, or that I'd have solar panels on my house, or that we'd have fuel cells backing up the operating rooms of hospital power supplies. These things all came down because of the investment we made in those technologies. And I don't know what we'll discover. There are some things that cannot be found on Earth that are found in the moon. The isotope helium-3 is one of the ones that has been discussed, and the head of the Chinese lunar program is very excited about that. He says that the equivalent of 3 space shuttle loads of helium-3 could power the entire Earth for a year with clean, non-radioactive energy. That's worth looking at. That material is very, very hard to find on the Earth. It's like 100 parts per billion in natural gas reserves in the Earth, but it's fairly relatively abundant in the moon's regolith.
And that leads into another question I had. You know, I've been to several mining operations, and it's amazing the small amount of rare earth elements that you find in a ton of ore. I mean, you're talking about ounces or less. Are there greater concentrations of these minerals and elements that you find in space than we could find here on Earth?
Indeed, and one of the most important things to realize, and that Michelle Hanlon touched on, is these are concentrated. I mentioned the large mass concentration near the South Pole, the Moon, and the Aitken Basin. That may be 90% of the Moon's mineral resources in that one spot. China or Russia could go build their lunar base right there, and there's a good reason to believe they will, and just exclude us from that in no time flat. Even if we're not worried about mining it for 50 years, we will have just signed off the future because we didn't deal with it today. So those resources are likely to be concentrated rather than evenly distributed. We need to get out there, as I suggested, and increase NASA's investment in the technologies and missions to identify where these resources are.
And Ms. Hanlon, this idea of the global commons of the resources that are in space, we know about the tragedy of the commons here on Earth if we think we can't exploit a resource enough and you get too many actors, and at the end of the day you have exploited the resource. What's the danger of having this view of the global commons, that it's going to be there, we can wait, and we don't have to take any action now?
Thank you, sir. The global commons is indeed ripe for tragedy. If you don't own, if nobody has a vested interest, then nobody has an interest in protecting and being responsible with respect to that commons. Here on Earth, we're seeing a lot of issues with people not respecting the high seas. Unfortunately, that happens to be also one of our biggest rivals, China. When we talk about environmental concerns and being responsible, this is one of the things we need to think about in this space race. If China does get to create the base and create a zone and set up a property area, and call it what it may, we're not allowed to own property in space, but it's going to be treated like property, because what is property? Property is the right to exclude, and that is exactly what China is going to do. That's what China does here on Earth, and we have no reason to believe they won't do otherwise in space. Fundamentally, the concept of global commons also suggests that nobody can own it. And as we look at the vast universe that awaits us, it is incredible anthropocentric hubris to suggest that all of the universe is somehow the responsibility of Earthlings, as if nothing else out there exists. We need to think about space very differently from the way we think about things on Earth, because it is infinite. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Chair, you're back.
I thank the gentleman from Georgia is recognized for his 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing. You know, I want to follow up off of what our chairman of the full committee said. As a matter of fact, it's not only in our jurisdiction, but, we've held field hearings all across this country for the past 11 months dealing with critical minerals and mining. And I would like to point out one thing, Mr. Chairman. I think it's rather obvious that as well as in those field hearings, our colleagues on the other aisle weren't even there for those, much less here for this one today. So when someone did pop in, it's no wonder she's a little confused that we might have jurisdiction. It's the fact that they don't participate. If I ramble on a little bit more, please forgive me, but I'm going to tell you something. China is in a race with us, and I'm sure that the American people know that, and if they don't, they need to know that. They've even stated that by 2045 or 2049, they want to be militarily, socially, economically, and even in space, be dominant over the world. And we need to be cognizant of that, and we also need to be paying attention to it, which is why I'm so glad that we are looking at things like what we're looking at today. You know, as a matter of fact, we have an administration that wants us to go EV on everything. But yet, Mr. Chairman, they refuse to let us mine. I mean, we were in Minnesota earlier, and we were talking about the largest deposit in the world of critical minerals in a town up there that is drying up because they've been trying to get permits for 20 years, but they can't do it. Over 80% of the critical minerals that we do process in this country are processed over in China by factories and smelters that are nowhere near green or as green as they could be. But yet here we are, not allowing our own people. So today, I want to continue to focus on China. And Professor Hanlon, you stated that legal norms in space will be developed based on activity. Whoever is first to establish space, resource management, and utilization will establish the corresponding legal norms. So, will the world benefit more from space resources if CCP controls the celestial mineral supply chain or if the United States controls the celestial mineral supply chain?
Thank you, sir. One of the greatest things about this country is that we have the opportunity for every person to speak and to talk and to give their opinion. We have hearings, we have notice of proposed rulemakings. Everybody has the opportunity to contribute, whether they're an indigenous person, whether they're male, female, cisgender, it doesn't matter. You have a voice if you're American. In China, that's not the truth, and that's not how the Chinese government works. I believe that if the Chinese were to get there first, I can't predict what they would do, but we can look at what they do here on Earth. They suppress their own people. They make claims to sovereign high seas as sovereign territory. If we want to see the equitable, responsible use of space resources and see them managed in an equitable manner, we need them to be led by a country and countries that are part of the Artemis Accords who will support freedom and democracy and equity here on Earth and in space.
So it's safe to say that America should focus on first obtaining a first mover advantage over space mining so that it can control both the legal framework and resource utilization policies that will most benefit our country? Is that correct?
I would say so that it could lead in the development of the framework, yes.
Thank you. And if America lets the Chinese Communist Party secure control over the celestial mineral supply chain, then all other concerns are practically useless because
Yes.
the CCP will just do what it wants.
Yes,
Yeah, regardless of any implications for others, right?
yes.
All right, thank you. Let's look at a worst-case scenario then, Dr. Autry and Professor Hanlon, real quick. I know I'm running out of time. What's the worst-case scenario if China wins the race for space mining, and how would you that negatively impact the United States? And Dr. Autry, you want to start with that?
Yeah, I don't want to be hyperbolic here, but if China wins the race in space, we've ceded the strategic high ground militarily, and we've ceded the entire economic future, and the United States will be relegated to a backwater position for the rest of human history. I honestly think this is an existential point.
Thank you. Professor?
I agree with Dr. Autry. If the Chinese will have the opportunity to block our access not just to the moon, but to all of space. And humanity's future lies in space. We have a lot of problems here on Earth to deal with, but a lot of the answers we will find in space, including, I believe, ultimately peace. Thank you.
Thank you. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I think the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Crane, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's an honor to be here. I represent Arizona's 2nd Congressional District. We have a good amount of mining that takes place in my district. For those of you guys that don't know, Arizona is the largest mineral producing state in the nation, provides about 2/3 of domestic copper. In May, the Biden administration stopped the opening of Resolution Copper in my district this mine could provide 25% of the demand for copper here in the United States of America. Kind of problematic. I want to start with some questions for you, Mr. Autry. Is it a national security issue to buy critical minerals from our enemies, in your opinion, sir?
Absolutely, sir. And as I noted, I've been spending years talking about the rare earth problem, and now everybody's woken up to that. I think they're going to wake up to the copper problem and the rest of these problems. If we tie our own hands behind our back in the geopolitical and economic competition of the future, we're going to have a very hard time of it.
Is it also an economic issue, Dr. Autry?
Absolutely. As I noted, having access to a reliable supply chain of factor inputs is critical, and China has demonstrated that they will change the prices to suit their needs, to grab excessive monopoly rents once they've gained control over the global supply chain, and they'll also cut us off or any other country off when they have the opportunity to leverage us politically. They, for instance, quietly stopped all rare earth element shipments to Japan several years ago in order to punish Japan for arresting a shipping captain who had rammed one of their Coast Guard ships, and they continue to behave that way.
Dr. Autry, what about real quick, what about outsourcing these jobs? What happens to these mining communities, sir, when we shut down a mine or, and then send that overseas?
We have in this country, unfortunately, denigrated and not supported our productive industries in manufacturing and resource extraction. It used to be that you could go get a decent job to support a family right out of high school in one of these industries. You can no longer do that, and we wonder why kids run up $200,000 debts and they're fighting over jobs at Starbucks. It's because of our lack of respect for these industries and jobs.
Okay, so we've already covered it's a national security issue. It's an economic issue. Is it an environmental issue as well, Dr. Autry?
Yeah, absolutely. As the other member mentioned, China doesn't do this well. In Mongolia, where they have processed rare earth elements using an incredibly destructive acid leaching process, the BBC did an article on it. They described it as the worst place on Earth, this toxic lake of sludge and mess that China is doing, because China is willing to destroy their environment and our global environment in order to gain competitive advantage. The U.S. would do it right.
The BBC, that's no right-wing outlet, is it, sir?
Yeah, it's a crazy conservative journal, I think.
So we've got national security, it's an economic issue, it's an environmental issue. Sir, why would we be doing this?
Because the Chinese are putting a lot of pressure quietly on a lot of people in our country to be focused only on short-term things, to be fighting each other, and to not paying attention to the strategic issues of the future. And we've seen that manifest here today.
They do put a lot of pressure on influential people in this country, don't they, sir? Are you familiar with what elite capture is, Dr. Autry?
Absolutely. In fact, I testified to the House Foreign Affairs Oversight Committee back in 2013 on Chinese perception management in the U.S. I wish I could say the situation had improved since then, but it has not. There's a lot of people in industry politics that are at various levels compromised by the Chinese Communist Party.
Yeah, that's right, sir. Dr. Autry, does it bother you at all? Does it concern you at all that this president and his son have taken money from the Chinese?
I'm hoping, frankly, to keep space as a nonpartisan domain, which has been very successful. Certainly, personally, I am concerned about that issue and any politicians where we would find that they were being paid odd consulting fees and tens of millions of dollars to do who knows what for a foreign government.
Yeah, thank you, sir. I think we should all be concerned about it and not, focus on some of the distractions that were just brought in the room regarding we need to be focused on climate change. You want to talk about distractions, that was a complete distraction. Thank you guys for coming. Thank you, Dr. Autry. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from Arizona, the gentlewoman from New Mexico. The ranking member is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. With all due respect to the comments that were made at the last round of questioning, if we're going to talk about members of Congress being compromised by elite interests from other countries, how about we talk about members of this committee who take campaign donations from multinational mining companies that the Chinese Communist Party has an interest in, including in Arizona. So, this is an important issue. Mr. Milazzo, I'm really grateful that you're here to talk about the ethical issues concerning the future of space mining. But it's hard listening to this conversation to really get a sense of what we're talking about here. So can you please help us understand what kind of minerals are we talking about mining?
So thank you for the question. In space, in our near Earth space, whether it's the moon or asteroids or even the asteroid belt or even all the way out to Mars, most of the minerals that we can find here on Earth are going to be found somewhere else in space as well. Not all of them. Some of the minerals that we find here on Earth require geologic processes like hydrothermal systems to concentrate those minerals into a valuable ore. Something that we can.
But just specifically, like, what are we talking about?
So we can talk about platinum group metals, golds,
yeah.
and we can talk about cobalt. We can talk about most of the strategic minerals that have been discussed are somewhere available for the most part in space as well as here on Earth.
Got it. Yeah, I was actually talking to a colleague who's a scientist who works at NASA about this issue over the weekend, and he was talking about asteroids that have been found that are, high concentrations of platinum, that themselves, these asteroids, are actually worth trillions of dollars if they were to be captured, mined, processed, and sold here on Earth. But I think, part of what gets lost in this conversation is that we're talking about commodities that sell on international markets, and the price of those commodities actually is, like all commodities, has to do with supply and demand, right? And so if we were to flood the global markets with supply and demand, it would impact all of these issues. But, I guess I'm still struggling technologically and feasibility-wise. Like, how far out is this? Even if we were to accelerate R&D in the United States and use international partnerships, like, how soon would we be able to tap these resources?
I think that's a great question, and I think it's a really difficult one to answer perfectly. We have companies that think they can go mining next year or 2 years from now or something like that. I think that's totally unrealistic. I think we're looking at decades at the best to actually return valuable amounts of materials to some kind of use, whether that's use in space or back here on Earth.
So we're talking decades out. And, for me, I think part of what's hard, my background's in the sciences. I've worked in natural resources management my entire career. And, the COP UN climate negotiations just wrapped up. And what we know, what the science is telling us, is that Earth is transforming so rapidly right now because of human emissions and the changes to our atmosphere that if we don't take immediate action, literally right now, in the next several years, we're not going to have a planet to live on. And so, as we're talking about trying to compete with China and get to these minerals first and establish our claims and to hell with global commons and celestial commons, like, we got some real issues here on planet Earth that we got to deal with right now. So I think part of what I really struggle with, and I'm all for R&D. I really, truly believe that we should be investing in R&D and all opportunities, and I understand the importance of competition. But my question is can this mining be done, which it sounds like is being proposed by private companies, without federal subsidization?
I think that's a great question, and I don't believe so. I think eventually, maybe yes, but I don't believe that there's a high enough return on investment on the timescales that most investors are looking for to realistically bring profits back to those investors without some kind of support from public funding.
Yeah, so I think that's where it comes back to, we're talking about jurisdictional issues here. Our role is to be good stewards of taxpayer dollars. And so at the end of the day, we have to ask questions like, does it make sense to spend billions of dollars in federal taxpayer dollars, which I think both of us across both sides of the aisle agree we should not be wasting taxpayer dollars on pursuing things that are not going to return a real value to the American people, especially as we're facing immediate crises. Should we be spending millions, billions of dollars to pursue R&D to subsidize private companies who are going to go then and capture those resources and use them for their own profits. And I think that is really the ethical, the public policy question in front of us. And the more immediate question is, how do we solve the problems we have on Earth and use the resources we do have to do so in a smart way? And Mr. Chairman, I know I'm out of time, but I look forward, I definitely would like to have another round. So thank you.
Thank you, the ranking member. Mr. Sundby, your testimony discussed the private sector's role, going right after the ranking members, in space resource development. How does the commercial space sector provide America a competitive strategic advantage, particularly as it relates to space mining?
Yeah, well, it's central. This will not be done by the government. And to address some of the concerns regarding public funding, I do want to let everyone know that most of the innovation in this country, with a multitude of our startups, are funded by public grants, right? The problem with that is that it has become entrenched, and venture capitalists generally do not fund many companies that have not already received public investment or public grants. So that has created a system that has been very reliant upon the government. That being said, I believe that the commercial space sector, and particularly commercial companies that are focused on dual-use technologies, and I want to emphasize dual use, that will benefit the Earth mining industry. It will allow us to better extract these minerals in a more environmentally friendly way, and it will benefit our nation. If we can focus on those dual-use technologies and these space companies can utilize those, that will obviously give us a massive strategic advantage both here on Earth and in space. And to that point of dual use, I do want to say this, mineral extraction, particularly lithium, is extremely environmentally degradable. And so the process of creating batteries and moving us towards electric vehicles is an admirable one. I fully support it, but there are problems with the extraction of this critical mineral here on Earth, and we need to be looking at options as we move forward, because it is still impacting our environment, moving from one form of energy to another. Thank you.
So in your opinion, it takes a lot of energy to look at this aspect. Would that be fair to say?
Yes, sir.
Immense. That's why the helium aspect is so important to the Chinese, is it not?
Yes, sir. Absolutely.
Because this is demonstrable fission, if I'm not mistaken, right?
It is fusion, nuclear fusion technology. It is generally theoretical, but there are numerous amounts of physicists that are very certain about its future, and we are becoming much closer to achieving it. Then the access to helium-3 will obviously be a mineral race, one likely that we have never seen before.
Gotcha. So now, the United States has a permanent base on the moon, right? Yet true or false?
What was that, sir?
The United States has a permanent base on the moon. True or false?
No, that is false. We do not.
How about China?
What was that, sir?
How about China?
China is preparing. They have outlined their
dark side of the moon, right?
What was that?
The dark side of the moon?
They have looked at strategic locations generally in the South Polar region, which is where we believe they will place their International Lunar Research Station. That is also the same region that we have looked at due to strategic access to water ice.
Gotcha. Now, private sector, I think in discovery, I would love to get back to first to discover instead of first to file. That would be so opportunistic for us to do. But dentistry, I can tell you right now, has benefited from space. The tiles for re-entry on the space capsule, those changed the whole concept of ceramics. So the density became much greater, much stronger, and you could cut colors with it, which is amazing. So that was big revolutionary. The other aspect was memory wire, where you could actually put a wire in a refrigerator, you plot the bands where teeth are need to move, and you put that band in there and see the patient a year later, and teeth are magically in place. So it's amazing what space has done, and we've always looked at that from that standpoint. Now, Ms. Hanlon, if China were to get the upper hand, would we ever get a chance to get it back from your viewpoint?
From my viewpoint, no, we would never have the chance to get it back.
So, Dr. Autry, I've heard a lot about these laser type products. How close are we to those in space?
I'm sorry, repeat that?
These lasers, these military lasers, how close are we, or how, from your understanding, how close are we to seeing this a reality?
The Chinese have already used laser weapons against U.S. satellites from the ground, and they are certainly entirely practical to use in space as well.
Could be a game changer, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. We're going to do a second round. So the gentleman, the chairman of the full committee, is recognized for his 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Gosar, and again, appreciate the witnesses taking some extra time. You know, this is an emerging field, a new concepts, a lot of unknowns. As I mentioned earlier, you know, the common sense with what we know today might say that it might not be a good investment, but there's possibility that it could be a tremendous investment. So just to maybe inform the committee more and to give you a chance to talk about something you may not have gotten asked, I want to start down on this end. And is there some question you wish you'd have been asked today that you hadn't been asked, or something you would like to leave the committee with?
Yes. So I would have liked to be asked, what is the role of the Space Force in all of this? And that's a question that I think many people do have. They are curious about this new service that we have. As I mentioned earlier in my remarks, the Chinese have created a Space Force, all right? They didn't call it a Space Force. It's called the Strategic Support Force. But they are paying attention to this matter. They are investing in this matter. They care about this matter. And we have been, as much as we have made advancements in this, we do shy away from discussing the difficult topic of our humanity from different nations going into space and being in that environment and having to protect our assets from a security perspective. And so my answer to that would simply be that we need to look at the Space Force and think of it more so how our Navy secures the high seas and allows for our shipping lanes and our conduct of industry and commerce in the ocean the same way that we will in space. And so we need to look at the Space Force from that perspective. We need to give it the ability to conduct that operation and understand that that will be under its purview as we go forward and further into space.
Thank you. Dr. Autry.
Sure. The topic I'd love to address is the use of public funds and helping us capture this industry before our competitors do. I'm fearful that some on the committee would not have funded the Lewis and Clark expedition because it was a distraction from whatever problems were going on in the East Coast at the time and cost too much money. I've heard the phrase unlimited money and billions of dollars tossed around. I want to be clear, we're talking about millions of dollars in research budget at the university level to help develop, again, dual-use technologies that will benefit us here on Earth and in space at the same time, and that should be one of the criteria that's applied to it. If you gave money to NASA to help them do additional research on space resources on the moon and on asteroids, they've done remarkable things for, again, millions or hundreds of millions of dollars. We're not talking about billions of dollars in the programs in any way. And one of the great things about space is that the entrepreneurial revolution that's been going on is making space cheaper. The cost of access to space launch, and the cost of satellites has been dropping year after year after year because we are commoditizing and commercializing something that used to be a government-run bespoke program. So this is not going to be expensive, and it's going to return benefits back to Earth. When somebody decided to do GPS, right, they were thinking about how can we help American troops or put smart bombs through a window, and nobody thought that it would create Uber and that it would create Pokemon Go and that it would be in everybody's pocket, in everybody's car, in every boat.
Along those lines, quickly, I've seen various numbers on the return on public investment in R&D. Do you have a off-the-cuff number?
Sure, I'll give you my favorite number. Motorola did a study a dozen years ago on the value of GPS to trucking fleets in the United States, and they determined that a truck is $52,000 per year more efficient if it's GPS equipped, fuel, tires, driver time, et cetera. We have 1 million of those trucks in the United States. That's $52 billion a year the United States gets back from its investment in just one space technology. That happens to be about the same as the entire U.S. expenditure on space every year.
Exactly, and it's amazing to me that we would argue that investing in R&D is a bad investment. Mr. Milazzo, would you like to?
Yes, thank you for the question. I appreciate the opportunity to speak. One thing that kind of makes me sad here is that we actually have the opportunity to reach across the aisle and agree on quite a number of things that we're talking about here. We've talked about dual use, we've talked about ethics, we've talked about a lot of things that we seem to agree on both sides of this aisle here, and yet there's still a lot of acrimony. We can do lots of good for the environment while we're building up our capacity to mine in space. It's not going to happen tomorrow. It's on our doorstep, sort of, but it's not science fiction anymore. But at the same time, we're talking about dual-use technologies and approaches to making space mining accessible. You cannot do that without doing it here on the Earth. And so we have to approach this in a collaborative manner rather than an acrimonious manner. And so my fear is that we're going to lose the ability to do both, improve our mining here on Earth, improve our environmental protections here on Earth, and lose our ability to do space mining simply because we're fighting and we can't come to some real agreements that we actually agree on across all of the different political spectrums. So it makes me a little bit sad that we're having this fight when we don't really need to have it. We could come to a really good set of bipartisan agreements here, tripartisan, multipartisan, whatever, and really build a functioning standard for both mining in space and improving our mining here on Earth. Thank you.
I'm out of time. I don't know if you want to allow Ms. Hanlon to answer that. Or
The gentlelady from New Mexico is recognized for.
Do you want to let her answer?
You can let her answer.
all right, Ms. Hanlon.
Thank you very much for the extra time. I would like to address the concept of why we are discussing space mining now when we don't think we're going to see a return or even a piece of metal within 60, 80 years. The fact of the matter is that the technology that we are developing to mine other countries, other worlds, can be used to benefit humanity here on Earth already. These technologies can be used to help us get into mines with robots instead of little children. With the mining for water in particular may help us find water here on Earth in pockets where we have the driest areas. Extracting and using off-Earth resources is going to make it easier and more efficient for us to explore more of the universe and maybe find those dilithium crystals. So we have to think about this not just about what the end goal is, but all of the things that we achieve on the way. And as we've seen, NASA puts out a magazine every year of all of the technologies that we have benefited from because they were either developed for space or they were spin-off technologies of stuff that was developed for space. The opportunities that are presented by space mining technology are truly boundless. Thank you.
For the full committee, the gentlelady from New Mexico, the ranking member is recognized for 5 minutes.
All right, well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to dig in just a moment about the budget and R&D and spin-off technologies. I'm a huge proponent of federal R&D to help support economic growth and opportunity. I think part of why you're seeing some partisan back and forth on this committee is, one, this is a hearing that actually should be in the Science and Space committee, which is actually a bipartisan committee that works a lot on these issues of space technology. So it's very unusual to have a hearing on this topic where we deal with public lands and waters. So there's a real, I think, jurisdictional question, though I do respect the chairman for his perspective on this, but I think that's part of the issue. So I used to work at OMB. I used to do the earth science for the budget for the Department of the Interior. That means I did USGS's budget and I worked on satellite budgets. And the federal government spends billions of dollars every day, well, every year, subsidizing commercial space exploration and technologies. It is billions. And space mining research and technology done at universities through NSF grants is a very small subsection of federal R&D monies. And certainly there's lots of spin-offs that comes from federal R&D. And I'm glad the chairman mentioned the heat-resistant tiles, because my grandfather, John Stansbury, who was an engineer, actually worked for the plastics company that perfected those tiles. And so we have a medal from John F. Kennedy that is still in my family from that era. But there are legitimate questions here, public policy questions about where we spend our money in the near term and the long term, and also how we approach this question of the commons and where we prioritize our funding, and whether or not it makes sense to try to outcompete China by unilaterally spending billions of dollars to help subsidize a private industry that's 60 to 80 years out in the future, rather than using international cooperation to try to pursue this. And I think this goes to, the bigger questions that the United States is engaged in since the onset of the Cold War and the arms race and the militarization and commercialization of space. And space is a commons. There are different treaties, of course, that govern it, but certainly when we started sending satellites up into space, we just thought it was, a vast unknown space where we could just put whatever technology up there, and now we have literally thousands of space junk objects in space that are a hazard to both our military establishment as well as the private sector, because we did not regulate those commons. And so now it's a huge and massive problem for all of us. But I also think it's important to acknowledge that we're not going to out-China China. I mean, first of all, China is a state-run economy. Almost every enterprise in China has some tie to the Communist Party, right? It is a state-run economy. China is also an authoritarian, non-democratic place at this particular moment. Part of why they have been successful in undertaking aggressive economic activity on every single continent and now in space is because it is not a free place right now. And the United States is a democracy, and we do have free enterprise here. And while I do support using federal dollars to help support R&D and exploration and pursue ideas that are important to the future, we're not going to outcompete China on this particular issue in this particular moment. But what we do know is that we have to solve our problems here on Earth. And I think that part of why we're seeing, as I said, contentious conversation here in this committee is because this committee's jurisdiction is really about solving problems on Earth, not in space. So I appreciate it and appreciate all of your comments, and I yield back.
I thank the gentlewoman. If we're going to pay our fair share and we talk about benefits, we ought to be bringing up the OPT program, the Optional Practical Training Program. Here's where the biggest of businesses get the biggest bang for the buck. They don't put their money into the Social Security and Medicare fund, but they're treated like everybody else. So something, if we're going to go down that line, we better take care of that. Ms. Hanlon, can you elaborate basically on Article 2 of the 1967 Outer Space Treaty? The question I have is, can you elaborate on any country or a private party can establish a resource extraction operation if territory cannot be claimed on a celestial body?
Yes, absolutely. Article 2 says that no territory in space may be claimed by any nation by sovereignty or by any other means. Therefore, while we do have a structure where we have this freedom of access and use of space, We are not permitted to actually plant a flag and say, this is mine. And again, the concept of property is an exclusion one. We don't want people to come in and not necessarily for malicious reasons, but because, for example, on the moon, the lunar regolith is very, very destructive. And if somebody drives too close to another operative machinery or one of our heritage sites, we will see a lot of damage done to that machinery. The interesting thing, the conflict within the treaty, is that Article 12 of the Outer Space Treaty actually anticipates that countries will have habitats and installations on other celestial bodies. And it states in Article 12 that you must give access to other nations to your installation on the basis of reciprocity. So what we have in the Outer Space Treaty, what we have in international space law right now, is a lot of conflict within the treaty itself about what it means. What actually does it mean when you build an installation on the moon? What actually can you do? Can you exclude other people or not?
So what makes it enforceable?
There are no enforcement provisions under the Outer Space Treaty whatsoever. At this point, right now, if there is an argument, a claim made, we must go through diplomatic channels, quote unquote. And those are arbitral, and then after that, you can go to the International Court of Justice, to an arbitral panel. Again, these things will take years to get through, and the concepts, there is no bright line rule. We're using this concept of due regard, which is a balancing test, which means that even as you look at these issues, as we look for private investors in space, we can't tell them that you can protect your property in space because we don't know what due regard means.
So without an investment, Dr. Autry, right now, what stops China from eliminating us from being even in a player in the space?
Repeat that?
Yeah, so now with some of the questions I asked you about the laser technology, what would stop us if we don't get involved now in space from China eliminating us, even being part of the process?
What we need to do is move quickly. We need to move with alacrity. And again, to address this issue of money, I never said anything about billions of dollars. If billions of dollars are being spent somewhere else, that's great. I'm talking about a reasonable amount of money for the NASA science budgets, for the Department of Energy and NASA science work, and a reasonable amount of money for academic institutions to help solve problems here on Earth that will also be applicable in space. We need to do those things. We need to do them now, or we could be blocked from access to space, as Michelle said. And I completely agree with Dr. Milazzo that we could have a very nonpartisan agreement here among the panelists. The concerns he has are real concerns and need to be addressed simultaneously to us moving forward with alacrity, because we are in a race we didn't necessarily choose to be in with a competitor who is proven to be a cheat here on Earth, and they're going to do that in space. And if we don't move now, we're going to hand that field to them.
So talking about dual use, you have Resolution Copper. My colleague from Arizona brought up Resolution Copper. Here's a company that spent $2 billion just cleaning up a mine site, making sure they have all the water they need and all that aspect. And here they were going to use robotics at 7,000 feet and below to mine this copper. This was going to be utilized for the future of technological mining on asteroids. That would be a dual use, right?
Absolutely, along with autonomous AI robots, as Michelle mentioned, to get the kids out of the cobalt mines in Africa, and power systems that Dr. Milazzo referred to that will have real benefits here on Earth.
So I'm going to get another question. What's our dollar backed by?
Delusion.
There you go. But, you know, if we actually had a good supply of rare earths, this could be a backing for our whole monetary funding. That's how expensive and how important these are. You know, we've even set up a consortium with Canada to try to get enough of these around. Last but not least, I'm aware of some different smelting processes that are now being pursued or actually pushed forward. Smaller, but they get everything out of the ore. Are you familiar with any of these?
it's not my area of expertise, but yes, I am familiar with advanced smelting processes. You know, we've seen the revolution here in the United States going to electric smelting for steel, for instance, at Nucor Steel. And space technology presents the opportunity for us to explore unique smelting and processing applications.
Well, I just got to tell you, you know, when I was a dentist, the ability to use ceramics on just a disease part was amazing, amazing. I could put something in, and then the color coding, I'd say find it. It's just amazing what's coming around with this technology. And you had firsthand knowledge of it. Well, with that being said, I thank all the witnesses for your valuable testimony and the members for their questions. The members of the committee may have some additional questions for the witnesses, and we will ask you to respond to those in writing. Under Committee Rule 3, members of the committee must submit questions to the subcommittee clerk by 5 p.m. on December 15th. The hearing record will be held open for 10 business days for these responses. If there's no further objection or no further business, I adjourn this meeting. Thank you. Thank you.